Welcome to Energy Vista, a podcast on energy issues, personal and professional trajectories. A podcast where we make experts great again and contribute actively to the public debate and policymaking around commodities, trade, and geopolitics. I'm your host, Leslie Palti-Guzman. Today is January 22, 2026, and time for a new energy episode. I'm delighted to be joined by Margheri, who is, among different titles, chairman of the World Energy Council in Italy, and he will discuss today under this hat, but he's also affiliated to ENI in Washington, D.C., and knows all about Europe, US relations, public affairs, government policy, energy policy. So I'm very excited to have this discussion at a critical moment in transatlantic relations, too. But before that, I wanted to mention that for years I've been advocating for the US not to shoot itself in the foot by aborting too soon its energy bonanza. With its rise as an energy power, um, notably due to the shale gas revolution, it has been a huge competitive advantage for the US at home for its economic growth and also abroad in its relations with trade partners. A huge diplomatical advantage. But now I'm a bit worried that the US could shoot itself in the foot by undermining its relations with key energy partners, notably Europe. However, I'm still very optimistic because if we look at the facts and at the data, the US is still doing everything to encourage exports and has never ever weaponized exports of LNG. Yes, there is a use of economic coercion in terms of trade tariffs, but it hasn't impacted energy flow. And also, let's face it, Europe needs US energy. It needs US shale to LNG exports to have a functioning economy. And we'll discuss this a little bit more in the podcast. But I'm wondering also, why is Europe freaking out so much these days? There is definitely the Greenland saga in the background, but even before that, Europe was worried and anxious about an over-dependence on US exports. And sometimes I'm wondering if it's not over-exaggerated, overblown, and who does it benefit? Are there some voices who want Russian gas back? Are there some voices that want to create actually divisions between Europe and the US? So all these are very interesting to me, and I'm both European and American, so I'm very, I've long supported transatlantic relations and advocated for strong transatlantic relations because I think, they are democratic countries that are inspiring the world. And I still believe that the US is a better place. The world is a better place when the US is the policeman of the world and where freedom, enlightenment prevails. So many questions, and I'm excited to discuss some of that today. Hi, Marco.
Buongiorno. Thank you for having me. Well, you're setting very high standards for our conversation. So
a bit more philosophical and deep, but let's start a little bit more granular. And European energy security following the war of Russia against Ukraine has profoundly changed. Even before the Greenland saga, right? There were already discussion and uneasy discussions in Europe about replacing a dependence on Russian gas with a dependence on US gas. Do you think right now, some of the assumptions that we had for the past 3 years have been broken, and are there already discussions to rethink European energy security?
well, in the picture that you've been drawing, I think there is the explanation of where, in many European capitals and in Brussels, the sense of the debate stands. Europe was relying, every European has been trained in the idea that after World War II, the global order was an order of, especially in the quote unquote West, interdependence, and that Europe could run the sense of codependency on multi-layered strategies and on multi-layered uh, relationships in a very smooth way. And the codependencies where politically with the United States of America and with the United States platform for global security. Energetically, with the web of pipelines and historical energy relations that were formed even at the peak of the Cold War with the Russian Federation, and that were the backbone of the Ostwende and of the Ostpolitik in key economies, especially in Germany. And also, I have to say that this vision has informed in the year 2000s and onwards the sense of codependency with China and a sense of uh, safety when Europe was relying on Chinese manufacturing and industrial capacities, sense of safety granted by the platform of global trade. Now, all of these senses of codependencies are challenged. They are challenged, obviously, by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that has broken the tie of codependency and that has proven that there were flaws in the dependence model that Europe had ultimately also economically thrived upon. So this has exposed a number of hypocrisies and a number of actually conflicts, internal conflicts in many policies at the national levels, especially I would say in Germany. We can come to that, but also at the European level. And obviously, it has challenged the main concept of the European energy policy and the overall set of targets that we had. Then the second victim of this new era was a sense of security of relying on Chinese manufacturing platforms forever and without consequences. We discovered that Europe had left to the Chinese producers entire supply chains that were absolutely essential to not only conquer our own targets but conquer the future. Obviously, solar. But then the trigger of awareness was when we saw German cars being overwhelmingly replaced by Chinese manufacturers. And that's, we're speaking 14 million jobs in Europe in the automotive industry alone. And now, and I'll stop here. But now the Greenland saga, as you mentioned, fits into a broader picture in which the sense of unbreakable bond in the transatlantic relationship is, I would say, challenged in a philosophical way when it gets put on an equal footing on all different transactional relationships. Europe is not used to treat the US and the friendship with the US as a transactional dimension, in a transactional dimension, as a tradable aspect. So I think there are
So Marco, yeah, to clarify what you mentioned by layers and the different sectors of the transactions, you're saying that basically now the US and Europe have to look at their relations like with military lenses, with energy lenses, with the mineral lenses. You know, so you're saying that they have like the whole relationship is systemic, basically. Like they have to look everything in as a whole, or
well,
you can still transact by sectors, by layers.
well, we are now in a point in time in which the U.S. administration, I would say the U.S. as a country, it precedes this administration, but obviously with this administration, is putting on the table big questions of rebalancing. The US has a new role in pivoting to Asia. And this was since President Obama. The leading from behind speech was in 2010 in Al Aqsa, Cairo. And we are 16 years down the line. But today, obviously, President Trump is facing Europe with fundamental questions. And he's asking for a transactional approach that Europe is not prepared to fully adopt yet. So this is clearly creating a set of issues. But if we look into the Vox, we see that political ties are still incredibly strong. We still have NATO, and actually Davos really was ultimately a rekindling of the value of NATO in this alliance. Uh, Economically, the ties between the two sides of the Atlantic couldn't be stronger. Politically, and I would say in a societal way, they couldn't be stronger. So, to your point, we live in an era where we need to strike good deals and we need to understand how relationships will grow. Energy is a backbone of this future relationship. Europe is the first market of US LNG, and the US is the first LNG supplier today and for the
Yeah.
foreseeable future.
So I think
So,
data to this point, I mean, Europe increased its imports of LNG in 2025 by 25%, I think, compared to last year, reaching like more than 100 million tons of LNG imports. And it represents, US LNG represents 56% of EU LNG imports in 2025.
so it's massive. So I have to say there is a moment of rebalancing. There is a moment of reconstructing a new order, but the underlying business ties, societal ties are there, and they cannot simply be forgotten in the political conversation. And
Yeah.
and, and we're
Do
please.
you think there is sometimes an over exaggeration on how unreliable the US can be as an energy partner? And like for me, I really don't equate the Russia gas weaponization with US economic leverage in energy trade. What do you think of this?
Well, the U.S. is a system. The U.S. as we know it for decades, uh, is a system where business is business and government is government. And that also applies to the energy sector, even if this administration is clearly providing more and more attention to the political framing of energy deals. But actually, deals in the US are struck business to business. Whereas when we go to other places of the world, obviously there is a government to government deal, and that government to government deal has across the board a government to business conversation that clearly goes on. Let's think of how national oil companies, also active in the gas sector, are structured in key suppliers of Europe. So uh, the concept of reliability still hinges on the US as a whole, as a system, being the platform for dollars as the main currency used in transactions in the world, as the platform for the rule of law and contractual sanctity, as the platform for regulatory and political stability. And in one way, I believe it is legitimate for Europe after the shock of having to reckon with its own mistakes and with its own overlooking dependence on Russia as a big issue. Now that Europe pivots away, there is a legitimate sense that we have to create a long term framework where the US and Europe in the energy sector are connected and are connected in a solid and stable and predictable way. I'll
Mhm.
give you an example. A great personality that we should have listened more to in Europe, I believe, that is Ambassador Dick Morningstar, who toured Europe as ambassador to the European Union and as special envoy for energy to promote energy independence and diversification, etc., etc. He also championed the EU-US Energy Council. The US Energy Council was born at a point in time in which Europe and the US were together on the buyer side of the table, really, and we're discussing the bigger picture. Now, the EU US Energy Council does not have a business component, which instead is obviously an essential backbone of energy discussions that will be held in the future. And let me add one element here. We're speaking a common passion for natural gas and LNG and how markets work. But Europe is also trying to focus a lot on other energy sources that can compound the role of natural gas and LNG. Take nuclear, for example.
Yeah, of course. I mean, diversification is the word of the game these days. Uh,
Correct. So
it's
where does the
diversification
US
of energy sources, all kinds, and also diversification of gas and oil supplies from different
So
sources.
the question is, where does the US fit in that technology picture? And I believe that if we look into all the key technologies that the energy system in Europe will rely upon, there is a transatlantic technologies, energy technology space that needs to find its own way beyond the trade disagreements and divergence. And so
Actually, I was wondering if the nuclear lobby in Europe, I mean, it benefits the nuclear lobby in Europe to push for this narrative of kind of the US is unreliable and kind of overreacting to each rhetoric from the White House to show how, it's important for Europe to accelerate its strategic autonomy, energy sovereignty, and try to decouple long term from the US on this energy interdependence.
well, let me say, I don't want to downplay how important it is that our American friends um, and partners understand that Europe exists, that the European Union exists, and it's not a treaty that is being constructed by chance or on specific matters. That there is a fabric, a European fabric, that is in the interest of the transatlantic relationship to, to preserve. And I'll give you an energy example. There is a clear role of the European conversation for European capitals to drive a new nuclear renaissance, be it in large scale nuclear, but also and most importantly on the priorities that America and the U.S. government, including this U.S. government, especially in the new Energy Dominance Council initiatives, has had. And I'm speaking infrastructure, and I'm speaking SMRs, and I'm speaking fusion when when it will come on stream commercially.
And
All
it's
of
a
these
huge
things.
opportunity for transatlantic cooperation because Europeans have expertise. There are still European companies, notably in France, for instance. I mean, because at the end of the day, Russia is the largest exporter of nuclear plants, I think, and China is building the most plants right now. So, there is huge opportunity for the transatlantic allies to kind of compete with them.
Agreed. And honestly, again, it's in the interest of the transatlantic relationship itself to have a coordinated view from Europe. If let me say this: if there was a coordinated view from Europe today, the energy policy of Germany would still encompass nuclear,
Yeah.
and that is definitely a key aspect. Now, to your point, it is true that in many European capitals, I wouldn't say I wouldn't know whether it's one lobby or another, but there is this sense of angst, this sense of skepticism vis-a-vis the new word, and there is also the need to recognize the role of gas in a way that was ideologically sort of put under the carpet at the European level. So all of
Mhm.
a sudden, we really have to have a multi-step reckoning. We have an awakening on the severing the ties with Russia. We have an awakening on the role of gas that will stay even if demand is clearly staying is sluggish over the past years. We clearly have a role of gas for the foreseeable future, and we need to nurture strategic long-term relationships with gas producers, starting from
Yeah.
the LNG.
Yeah.
And there is crucial areas in the energy technology business where we need to project European manufacturing capabilities. My own country, Italy, is the second largest manufacturing company in Europe, we absolutely have the skills, the competencies, the technologies to play a major role in the new energy technology landscape, including nuclear. Uh, it is sounder and better and more fulfilling if there is a coordinated European approach. And I
Yeah.
believe, again, this is also in the interest of Washington.
Yeah, sometimes it makes me think a little bit like the Cold War, except that now, there are two big powers, the US and China, and Europe is trying to find a third way, non aligned necessarily. But it's a tough, road to navigate, because the US is increasingly, I think, requesting full alignment. You're with us or you're against us in a way. But we mentioned a little bit the oil and gas companies, and yeah,
Let me make a quick point on the question of China. Um, Now, there are areas where China has built a capacity that is serving the world.
hmm,
I am not sure it would really be a sensible uh, uh, policy to start reinventing the wheel. On
yeah,
solar panels, the degree to which China has established global leadership is hard to beat if we want to maximize the effectiveness of
yeah.
this technology.
And that's why the US is focusing on other energies where they can still have the competitive advantage and the full control of the supply chain.
I think when we move to the supply chains of the future or to fast evolving supply chains, and I also add batteries in this spectrum because obviously batteries have been growing immensely and Chinese capacity is significant. But we're also seeing an incredible set of technology advantages there that can still be built. So there
Yeah,
is an exponential curve on the improvement of battery technologies. There, Europe and the US cannot give it for granted
yeah,
that they don't have a role to play. Take Pax Silica, the new AI and digital transition framework that the US is bringing forward from critical minerals through refining down to, let's say, it's a well to wheel approach. Europe needs, and European countries are already there. They're not the only ones. But I believe that the European single market, the European the industrial and technology platform has to play these things in a coordinated way.
yeah. Like I feel sometimes that for the US, what is like a top priority these days is the AI race with China, securing energy resources, minerals to feed this race, basically. And I don't think it has completely synced in Europe, like this sense of priority. Um, and, like the Venezuela episode, which in part has been driven also to acquire some of the resources. Part of it, I think that the White House now is also using and embracing the energy companies as really strategic tools for its energy dominance agenda. And yes, it's still private companies. There is no US state owned company, but increasingly they are viewed as an extension of US diplomacy. And ENI in Italy, for instance, has also had a critical role to play after the war in Ukraine, has contributed to the diversification of supply for Italy, for instance. Do you increasingly see a new role for oil and gas company in this kind of more volatile geopolitical world?
Well, let me separate two answers to this. I'll start from the latter part of your reflections. Italy moved fast in 2022 thanks to the initiative of the government, which was enabled by ENI, which is, as you mentioned, the company I have the honor to serve here in the US. But it leveraged on a stack of existing relationships that were built in North Africa and in Sub-Saharan Africa, and obviously also in the US ultimately. So there was an approach that was prepared. Let me remind ourselves that Italy did have the infrastructure in place and actually moved fast on adding some LNG capacity. But it did have the Southern Corridor, that was the last diversification route built in Italy. It had connections with Libya. It had connections with Algeria via Tunisia. It had already some LNG facilities connecting Italy with global markets. The same cannot be said for the critical platform of Germany, and the same cannot be said when you look uh, down from Brussels to a coordinated vision for Europe. We have plenty of LNG capacity, of regas capacity in Spain that
Yeah.
was completely bottlenecked by the lack of interconnections with France and could not really provide the solution where it was needed.
Yeah, and as
So
a reminder for our listener, I think Italy used to be one of the largest buyer of Russian gas
that
in
is
Europe.
correct. And we could do minus 50 the first year, minus 80 the second year, and minus practically everything the third year. And let me also be specific here. We really replaced those long-term molecules with a long-term strategy and outlook. So today, I believe Italy is, frankly speaking, presenting a good example of how you can deal with this and how you can think to a robust and strategic vision for energy policies. And Italy has been, I think, overlooked in its efforts historically to diversify its relationships.
Yeah.
But let me build on this to
And if I
how
can
to.
mention something here, is that interestingly, Italy has diversified a lot with North Africa and the rest of Africa. So Algeria, Libya, Egypt, even some exploration, I think, around Cyprus. So in East Med, and then in Africa, Angola, Mozambique,
Congo.
uh, Congo.
Yeah.
And interestingly, not that much in US shale gas in terms of gas resources. Or, I mean, is it because of the geography? North Africa, Africa is closer to Europe, easy to ship the molecules. How do you think of, or it's, as you mentioned, like strategic historical relationships that have helped?
Well, historical relationships clearly were there, and they were long term.
Yeah.
In the case of Italy, they are embedded in the actually in the DNA of key companies, starting from many, of course. And there is a set of uh, reciprocal knowledge. There is a set of uh, technology had played a crucial role in establishing operational excellence that was particularly valuable in those contexts where any had already thrived. So I believe that this comes from an historical background, and that the shape of the industry, let's say the strategic outlook of the industries was different. So I believe that explains. But you also mentioned, and I think it's a very interesting and important point, how the role of the energy industry is, I wouldn't say novel, but it's enhanced with the Trump administration. And I would say, number one, you have got great energy competencies in the administration. And when I say energy, I mean the sector. I'm not. I don't mean specific clusters of the sector. There is an all-out understanding that energy needs to work as a system, and that the politics, policies, and the agency to operate on the ground to really to download this in real actions and need to cooperate and work together. So there is a role, I believe, for energy companies on a number of dossiers, and there is, I think, an understanding of how also, let's say, in legacy energies and in new technologies, the public hand and the private hand really have to communicate better. I believe that Brussels is progressively taking stock of how uh, the public, the public hand and the private hand in the past have not communicated well enough. And it's not only with energy companies. Again, the automotive sector. Imagine we had to go to the near drama to repeal the target of wiping out an industrial capacity of Europe, which was internal combustion engines, and really instead adopt a technology neutral decarbonization approach where you can have biofuels and e-fuels and all areas where Europe is also very strong to plug into that backbone and ensure that it has a role in the energy transition. I believe this was a mistake in the European construction, and I think on both sides of the Atlantic, a better dialogue can only be
Yeah.
positive in terms of
Yeah.
setting the right targets and setting the right policies.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I've seen it in a certain way for shipping, like looking at the decarbonization of fuels used for shipping. It cannot be done without taking into consideration the just the ship and what's feasible in terms of technology today, tomorrow, and how fast. And there are so many dimensions of the puzzle. So I think Brussels is really good at giving the directions, but sometimes it doesn't always match with the market, and the technology available.
I'm old enough to have been in Brussels when the emissions trading scheme was starting. And I do remember that the initial learning phases were actually marred by the design of the policy set itself, because you had the emission trading scheme that was the backbone of decarbonization, but then you had piled it up with specific technologies, specific directions, set of targets that were conflicting. That was the beginning of a mistaken approach. Setting a clear target for making the energy transition in Europe functional is a good thing. But then mandating the ways that market should work was ill conceived. And it would be ill conceived in any scenario. So today we are in a position, I believe, in which the European policymakers are realizing this. I think it was a little overlooked because it's a little nitty gritty ish for those who love the European process. But when we went to the discussions on the CS and the discussion on simplification, what was incredibly interesting is that the European Parliament, which is typically the most stubborn European institutions when it comes to dragging one's feet on opening to private sector views. It was the European Parliament to be quote unquote harsher than the Commission in slashing, in asking for slashing those areas in the CSDDD that would not work. And I think it's maybe a little, but it's an important signal that something in the mood in Europe is changing out of fear, out of uncertainty, out of maybe too much anxiety in some cases. But I believe that a strong reaction. I'm a good reader of the Draghi report. And
I was going to say, I think one of the maybe key driver for this newfound pragmatism in Europe could be like this new priority of competitiveness. Like I think it finally reached the top policymakers in Europe that that should be the priority, and potentially even above green activism and decarbonization. And I mean that, if you don't have a functioning economy, there is nothing left for you to try to make it greener.
I had an interesting conversation, friendly, apologies, I will not name the names, but with a very, very senior leader of the European Union. And they came here and had a number of chats in town. And then we had dinner. And the first thing that I was asked is, how come Washington seems to be the capital in the world where the Draghi report was read with more attention? And my point was, well, maybe reread it and, maybe just act on it, because there is a big issue. If you look into European experts, and again, I'm very sensitive to manufacturing. I'm very sensitive to how the products that we can imagine on technology, on mechanical excellence, on steel and specialty steels, on specialty chemicals, and obviously coming from Italy, in everything that appeals to global taste. Well, this needs to remain one of our strengths. And in the European Union, they're now sluggish, whereas in the US, exports have been significantly growing. We need to take stock of the lesson that the US has given us on driving growth. I believe that the US should absolutely continue understanding that global growth is underpinned by playing a cohesive role in the world and not a divergent role in the
Mhm. Well, it's also a very good message, Marco, what you're saying that Europe is taking stock, Europe is gradually changing and understanding, the big priorities such as competitiveness. And because I think, right now in Washington still care about Europe, but has a certain idea of Europe or a certain idea of where Europe should head. And so I think, this narrative that, Europe is taking action, I think should make its way to the White House.
and I believe that Europe, I'll give you one example of where it's particularly evident that if the transatlantic communication works, we're stronger, both of us, and if it doesn't, we're weaker. And it's the relationship with third countries. Now, clearly, now that the global order, I will not dig into these too high level conversations for me, but now that the global order is in reshaping, you clearly have the two global ambitions of the US and that of China, but you also have the emergence of crucial players. You mentioned AI. How can you think to AI in the future without thinking to what the Gulf is doing? And actually, to your previous point on the role of IOCs, but oil and gas companies, well, let's look into what the energy companies in the Gulf are doing spectacularly to foster new technologies, the energy transition, but also investments in the broader picture of the new digital plus energy future. Well, Europe clearly has a set of relationships, a set of ties, a projection towards the MENA region that was second to none, and that was also underpinning the sense that NATO and the US providing the security platform through Europe and with Europe was also granting the US a better projection in those environments. Now, if we diverge, what remains of, for example, the projects of reshaping supply chains for critical minerals from sub Saharan Africa? If transatlantic partners do not work together, we have the good example of the Lobito corridor, maybe the only project that has transitioned from previous administration into a priority of this administration. But if we don't work together on those corridors, IMEC, PTEC,
I
which
was
has
going to
been,
say IMEC. Yeah. Mhm.
which has been a great priority of this administration, if we don't work together there, these projects lose relevance to third parties. We need to work together on Africa. We need to work together on the Middle East. And I believe that this is something that has to happen with more pragmatism on the European side, but also has to happen with keeping hold of the transatlantic relationship here
Mhm.
in DC.
Good. Well, I hope you're right about Europe changing. And thank you for on this optimistic note. I'm just going to ask you one last, more personal question. How do you feel these days as a European in Washington D.C.? Have you seen a change? How do you think what's the mood?
It's a complicated question to answer because number one, apologies for putting myself at the beginning of this answer, but I'm Italian and I'm a pro-European Italian. I believe that believing in Europe has granted my own country with great opportunities. So, first of all, being Italian in DC today is a great thing. This has continued through different views of the world, through different administrations, through different policy lines. But there is a great appreciation of Italy, from the personal dimensions to obviously the lifestyle, to the role that Italy plays as now significantly and impressively a beacon of stability in Europe, something that as a kid I was not really used to imagine.
And your prime minister is well seen right now.
Yeah, and I believe that Italy can be absolutely instrumental in also channeling this idea that Europe as a whole is a fabric that is not there to be unraveled and dismantled. And here I believe that there is a conception in many in the Washington arena that still lacks understanding of the European Union. The European Union is a very complicated institution. We all know that.
Sometimes slow, but eventually get things done.
And ultimately, what the European Union has done really bears value to build the future. It has brought people together, leaving them different, leaving them in with an individual dimension, but also keeping them together on the fundamental choice of the future, of having a future that is solidaristic, that is a future built on togetherness instead of a future built on divergence, as it had been the case for centuries. So I think that part of the conversation really needs reviving and revamping in DC.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Marco. And we'll discuss more. There are so many other topics I wanted to tackle, but we already did a lot. Thank you so much.
Enough. Thank you, Leslie.
This episode was recorded on January 22, 2025. This is Leslie Palti-Guzman saying good day and good luck. If you like what you hear, want to support Energy Vista, discuss sponsorship, or send feedback, contact me.